Chapter 3 of this year's Green Budget looks at the latest fiscal forecasts, considers some of the main risks around those forecasts, and looks at the challenges that might face the public finances over the next decade or so. Now, this graph shows public spending and public receipts since the year 2000. You'll see that we're still spending quite a lot more than we're raising in tax revenue. In 2015-16, the deficit was equal to £76 billion, around 4% of national income. And that was the fourth highest deficit among 28 advanced economies. The deficit is set to fall only slowly this year, reaching £68.2 billion, or 3.5% of national income. And that's almost twice the average level of deficit that we ran between 1948 and 2008. So the level of the deficit is still high, and it's set to fall further over the next few years. The pace of deficit reduction is first steady over the next couple of years through a combination of tax rises and spending cuts. But the profile of deficit reduction is not even. In particular, there's a very large fall planned in 2019-20 as a result of cuts to spending. But beyond that very large fall in 2019-20, there's hardly any more consolidation planned. And that means that in 2021-22, we're set to have a deficit of 0.7% of GDP. Now let's step back for a moment and take these plans in perspective. If these forecasts are correct, we would be spending our lowest proportion of national income since 2003. And you'd have to go back to the mid-1980s, to 1986-87, for the last time that the tax burden was as high as it's due to be. So quite a low level of spending historically, and a high level of tax, but we're still set to have a deficit in 2021-22. And that would have been in breach of George Osborne's fiscal target, which required that we reach a surplus by 2019-20. However, the new Chancellor has a new set of fiscal targets, and they allow him rather more flexibility than did his predecessors. None of the new fiscal targets apply during this Parliament. The first that does apply is the fiscal mandate. That requires that the cyclically adjusted deficit, that is, borrowing taking into account the temporary strength or weakness of the economy, must be below 2% of national income in 2020-21. Now, the current forecast implies that we would have a deficit much lower than that in that year. And that means that on current plans, the Chancellor could increase spending or cut taxes by over £25 billion in that year and still meet his target. The second target concerns welfare spending. The welfare cap is similar to the previous target of the same name. It includes most welfare spending, but doesn't apply until 2021-22. And the third target concerns the national debt. And it requires that public sector net debt fall as a proportion of national income between 2019-20 and 2020-21. So let's look at the profile of debt in more detail. Public sector net debt has more than doubled since the financial crisis as a proportion of national income, largely as a result of the very large deficits that we've run over that period. Note that the debt is also set to increase quite sharply over the next couple of years. Now, that's not primarily driven by the forecast deficits that we're set to run in those years, but rather it's due to a Bank of England scheme called the Term Funding Scheme. Now, under the TFS, the bank is going to offer commercial loans to commercial banks that have to be paid back in 4 years' time. Now, the way that this is accounted for in the numbers is that when the loans are offered out, the value of the loans is added to the national debt. So if we look at public sector net debt, excluding the Bank of England, you see that the profile is much flatter over the next few years. However, the converse of the debt increasing when the loans are offered out is that when those loans are paid back, the debt will also decrease quite quickly. That's set to happen between 2019-20 and 2020-21. That's convenient timing for the Chancellor's fiscal target. He would have to run a deficit of almost 4% of national income in that year for that target to be missed. So those are the fiscal targets that apply over the current forecast horizon, up to 2021-22. But there's also a broader objective for fiscal policy, that the public finances be returned to balance as soon as possible in the next Parliament. And that means that 0.7% of national income deficit that we're set to have in 2021 must be eliminated by 2024-25 at the latest. And that means that on current plans, further austerity will be required beyond 2021-22, even though that's more than a decade after the consolidation first began. I'm now going to look at the consolidation plan for this Parliament between 2015-16 and 2019-20 in more detail. How are we actually getting the deficit down over that period? So in 2015-16, we had that deficit of £76 billion. We're set to enact quite large tax rises over this Parliament. Actually, most of these tax rises have already been enacted in the last year. Some of the large tax rises include, for example, the introduction of the apprenticeship levy this April. Luke's going to talk more about apprenticeship policy after the break. And there are also set to be increases in the rate of insurance premium tax. Welfare cuts over this Parliament are worth about £12 billion. The largest of these is the 4-year freeze to most working age benefits that Andy mentions. And there are also reductions in the generosity of universal credit. Now, if government increased departmental spending in line with the size of the economy, we wouldn't expect the deficit to increase or decrease. But that means that holding departmental spending constant in real terms, just adjusting for inflation, actually leads the deficit to fall quite a lot. And over this period, the government's actually going a little bit further, cutting in real terms departmental spending by about £3 billion. However, looking at departmental spending as a whole misses some nuance. In particular, there are very different trends for day-to-day spending and capital spending. So this is what's happened to day-to-day spending over the last few years. You'll see that there was a large real cut of about £20 billion between 2010 and 2012. But in the years since then, it's been broadly flat in real terms, falling by only £3 billion. However, from next year, the cuts are set to restart. And overall, between 2016 and 2021, there's set to be a real cut of about £12 billion to day-to-day spending. Now, the opposite of true is capital spending. That also fell sharply in the early 2010s and has been broadly constant since. But it's set to increase dramatically over the next few years, an increase totaling £16 billion in real terms between 2016 and 2021. So taking these two graphs together, that's a shift in what the government is choosing to do, away from current spending, more towards capital or investment spending. So those are the main measures that the government's planning to enact over this Parliament. However, even if the government had enacted no measures at all, the deficit might still have changed. This would have been due to underlying changes in the public finances, for example, resulting from the strength or weakness of the economy. Now, we expect the economy to grow quite sluggishly over the next few years, and that means that had the government not enacted any policy measures at all, underlying changes might have led the borrowing to increase by about £6 billion. That leaves a forecast deficit in 2019-20 of about £22 billion. So this chart shows the planned profile of deficit reduction over this Parliament, but of course that's much slower than what we've previously been planning to do. Consider, for example, the March 2015 plan. And that was before the last general election, and then we were hoping to reach a surplus by 2018-19 and be borrowing £29 billion less than we now plan to do in 2019-20. So where is this £29 billion discrepancy in borrowing come from? I'm now going to compare this, the current plan, with the equivalent plan that we had in March 2015. And I'm going to change each of these elements to what they were back before the last election. So we borrowed about as much in 2015-16 as we hoped that we might in March 2015. But there are quite large changes in the size and composition of the consolidation. There were hardly any net tax rises announced for this Parliament before the last election. Almost all of those were announced in the year following the general election. This is a common thing that governments do, raise taxes after elections. There are also no welfare cuts specified in the official plans before the last general election. And that meant that almost all of the deficit reduction was occurring through departmental spending restraint. So looking at the difference in measures between this plan and the plan before the last election, the deficit would have been slightly lower, at about £11 billion rather than £22 billion, but we would still have had a deficit. However, back in March 2015, we hoped that the economy might grow much more strongly over this Parliament than we now expect. A strong economy is good for the public finances, and that meant that rather than underlying changes leading borrowing to increase by £6 billion, they would have led borrowing to fall by about £12 billion. That's an £18 billion turnaround between March 2015 and now. That accounts for more than 2/3 of the difference in borrowing, and it shows that when you're thinking about deficit reduction, the measures that governments announce may not be as important as economic performance. So those are the main plans as they stand. I'm now going to consider the main risks to the forecast. What may mean that, in reality, these forecasts are incorrect. First, I'm going to consider policy risks. In what ways might policy differ from what this forecast currently assumes? Well, on tax policy, there may seem to be relatively few risks. In particular, most of the tax rises planned for this Parliament have already been enacted. However, there are some promised tax cuts that are not currently featured in the plans. In particular, the government is expected to honour its manifesto commitment to increase the personal allowance to £12,500 and the higher rate threshold to £50,000 by 2020-21. And on current forecasts for inflation, that would cost about £1.75 billion. Furthermore, fuel duties have been frozen in cash terms since 2011, despite being due to increase with inflation in every year since then. Given that successive chancellors seem addicted to freezing fuel duties, we might imagine that that could continue for the rest of this Parliament. If fuel duties did continue to be frozen until 2020, that would cost a further £2.5 billion. So these policies combined might reduce receipts by about £4.25 billion in today's terms. What about the other side of the ledger on spending policy? Well, there's actually one quite large positive risk on the spending side of the forecast. The current forecast assumes that when we stop making an EU contribution, we'll continue to spend all of that money elsewhere in the public sector. However, we could replace all EU funding that currently takes place in the UK and still have about £8 billion left over, which we could use to reduce the deficit. So a positive risk there on spending. However, there is also a negative risk. I showed you earlier that the cuts to real departmental spending are restarting again this year, and these spending cuts might be difficult to deliver. Delivering the departmental expenditure cuts plan might be all the harder because we're not sharing the burden evenly across departments. So this chart shows departmental spending plans between 2016 and 2019 for different departments. Notice that the transport budget is set to increase dramatically over the next few years. That's largely a result of what I told you earlier, that capital spending is going to increase, and the transport department does a lot of capital spending. However, there are other departments that are also protected from the brunt of the cuts. International development, defence, health and education are all ring-fenced in some way. However, that means that to achieve the cuts that we need to achieve, other areas need to be cut more. And in particular, there are cuts planned of around 20% for example, DEFRA and business. What may make these cuts all the harder to achieve is that the same areas that are set to be cut further over the next few years are also the ones that have been cut most previously. So if we look at the cumulative cuts between 2010 and 2019, the plans imply that some areas like justice or business would have 40% real-term cuts between 2010 and 2020. Now, one consequence of our spending priorities in the last Parliament and this one is a change in the makeup of the state. So in 2007, public spending was about 39% of national income. And in 2019, it's set to be about 38% of national income. But it's not an even cut across the board. In particular, we'll be spending more on some areas. George is going to talk a bit more about health spending after me. And pensioner benefits and overseas aid are also set to make up a larger proportion of national income. However, that means that other areas need to be cut by more. In particular, we'll be spending less on working age benefits, debt interest or defence, less on schools, and much less on public order and safety. That 0.7% cut for public order and safety is particularly large when you consider that the budget was only about 1.5% of national income to start with. So there are some policy risks facing this forecast. There are some promised tax cuts that aren't currently factored in, and there's a risk that we may not be able to achieve the spending cuts that we need to achieve. But while there are some policy risks, the main risks on this forecast and over the next few years are undoubtedly over the economy. Between March and November, the OBR downgraded its forecast for the size of the economy in 2021 by 1.2%. And they judged that this led to an increase in borrowing of £8.2 billion in today's terms, or to put that another way, £6.8 billion for every 1% downgrade to the economy. Now, the main risk is that perhaps the economy will just grow less quickly than the OBR hopes over the next few years. In the Green Budget document, we consider what would have happened if the Bank of England November forecast was correct. Now, of course, the Bank of England has since revised its forecast, and it no longer substantially disagrees with the OBR. But there remains uncertainty out there, and don't be surprised if you see forecasts moving in either direction over the coming years. And I said that in that November forecast, for every 1% that the economy was smaller, borrowing increased by about £6.8 billion, or 0.35% of national income. Now, this is actually quite a modest effect on borrowing from what we might normally expect. In general, the OBR estimates that a 1% downgrade to the economy increases borrowing by 0.5% of national income. So why was the effect less in this forecast? Well, largely it was due to the composition of the downgrade to GDP. In particular, investment is set to be quite weak over the coming years. Now, in the short run, lower investment actually increases tax revenue as companies offset current investment costs against current profits. However, in the longer run, we'd expect that less investment today will mean lower profits and lower wages in the future. And that means that the true cost of lower growth now on the public finances could be about an extra £3.5 billion to borrowing. So the main economic risk is undoubtedly on growth, but there are other economic risks too. Take, for example, household inflation. Between March and November, the OBR increased its forecast for household inflation, largely as a result of the depreciation in sterling. Now, this was set to increase borrowing by about £2.8 billion over this forecast period. Higher inflation is bad for the public finances because it means that thresholds like the personal allowance get uprated more quickly, so we raise less in tax revenue, and some benefits are also linked to the CPI. However, there's also uncertainty about how much inflation there will be over the next few years. The Bank of England expects even more inflation, that the CPI will reach a higher peak and stay higher for longer. And if that were correct, that would add a further £1.1 billion to borrowing. The last risk I'm going to consider is on interest rates. Since 2007, the national debt has more than doubled as a proportion of GDP, but debt interest spending has actually fallen over that time. Now, that's due to a combination of low interest rates and the accounting effects of the Bank of England's quantitative easing programme. So if gilt rates rise or the bank rate rises faster than forecast, then debt interest spending will also increase. In particular, for every 1 percentage point rise in the bank rate, there'll be £4.4 billion more debt interest spending. And the OBR estimates that a 1 percentage point rise in gilt rates adds about £5 billion to debt interest spending by 2021. So those are the main risks, both policy and economic, that face the forecast over the current forecast horizon up to 2021. But recall that there's a longer-term fiscal objective that requires elimination of the deficit by 2024-25. And this is not likely to be easy. The OBR expects economic growth to remain sluggish over the next decade or so as the UK adjusts to its new trading relationship with the EU and other partners. And there are also set to be significant upward spending pressures over this time. The effect of demographics effects, such as ageing and other pressures, on health spending, long-term care spending and pension spending is set to be worth about 1% of national income between 2021 and 2025. 1% of national income pressure over just 4 years is a really huge additional pressure to public spending. So how hard might it be to eliminate the deficit in the next Parliament? So on current forecasts, we would have a deficit of £14.25 billion in 2021-22 in today's terms. If we also factor in those additional spending pressures worth 1% of national income or £19.5 billion, that could mean that a consolidation of around £34 billion might be required. And that's even before you factor in those tax cuts that are promised but not yet reflected in the plans, and the possibility that the economy might grow more slowly than the OBR expects. So to sum up, there's more deficit reduction planned over this Parliament. That's being mostly achieved through large cuts to day-to-day departmental spending, and that's after 3 years where day-to-day spending has been more or less constant in real terms. We're forecast to reach a deficit of about £22 billion in 2019-20, but there are risks that mean even this may not be achieved. In particular, there are some promised tax cuts that are not currently on the books, but the main risk concerns the path of the economy. If the economy grows more slowly, it's likely that that borrowing forecast will increase. On current plans, there's set to be no further consolidation beyond 2019-20, And achieving that fiscal objective of eliminating the deficit in the next Parliament does not look to be easy. In particular, there may be a consolidation worth around £34 billion that will be required in order to meet that target. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to George, who's going to talk about NHS and social care spending.